The radio crackled once, then silence. Somewhere in the valley below, a man was moving. He didn't know he was already dead. He didn't know that a woman was lying flat on a ridge 3,247 meters away, slowing her breathing to 4 counts in, 4 counts out, pressing her cheek against cold polymer and staring at him through a scope the size of a telescope. He didn't know that she had calculated the wind, the elevation drop, the temperature shift at altitude, the Coriolis effect of the Earth's own rotation, all of it, already before he took his third step. He didn't know her name, he didn't know her rank. He didn't know that the man lying next to her, a decorated Navy SEAL captain with 2 combat tours, a chest full of ribbons, and a particular brand of quiet arrogance that comes from surviving things that kill other men, had spent the last 4 minutes being absolutely certain she was going to miss. She didn't miss. The shot hit before the sound arrived. That's what people don't understand about extreme long-range precision fire. The bullet travels faster than the noise it makes. The target is already down before the valley even knows a trigger was pulled. 1 second the man was moving, the next second he was not. And the sound came rolling in afterward, like an afterthought. A long, low roar, bouncing off rock and snow and silence, filling the valley like thunder from a storm that had already passed. The SEAL captain lifted his head from his own scope. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, very quietly, into the radio he said, "Who's the target?" His spotter thought he meant the man in the valley. But he wasn't asking about the man in the valley. The man in the valley was no longer relevant. He was asking about the woman beside him, the one he had doubted from the moment she arrived at the forward operating base, the one he had quietly, professionally, with full military courtesy, tried to have reassigned before the mission launched, the one who had said nothing in response to his skepticism, had simply picked up her rifle, walked to the range, and done what she did. He was asking, who is this person? What is she? Where did she come from? Because in 22 years of special operations, he had never seen a shot like that. And he had made a mistake. And he was man enough, barely in that moment, but still, to admit it. This is the story of Lieutenant Commander Mara Voss. It is a story about precision, about patience, about what it costs a woman to become the best at something the world spent decades insisting women couldn't do at all. It is about a valley in the mountains, a rifle, a shot that broke a record, and a set of assumptions simultaneously. It is also about the SEAL captain, because his story matters too. Because the hardest shots are not always the ones fired through a scope at 3,247 meters. Sometimes the hardest shot is the one you take at your own certainty, the one that requires you to aim directly at everything you believed and pull the trigger. Both of them took that shot that day. Only one of them was holding a rifle. Sit down. This one is going to take a minute. The base sat at 2,100 meters above sea level, wedged into a fold of mountain that the maps labeled with coordinates instead of names because nobody had ever cared enough to name it. The wind came sideways off the ridge most mornings, cold enough to make your eyes water even through ballistic glass, and the dust from the unpaved landing pad hung in the air long after the helicopters left, coating everything, boots, teeth, radio equipment, in a fine brown layer that tasted like chalk and old iron. It was not a comfortable place. It was not meant to be. Captain Derek Holt had been stationed at Fob Karim for 11 days when the orders came through. He read them twice. Then he set the paper down on the folding table that served as his desk, picked up his coffee, drank from it slowly, and read them a third time. A female sniper from the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment Support Detachment was being attached to his unit for an unspecified duration. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Mara Voss. Her file, which had arrived with the orders, was thin in the ways that meant things had been redacted rather than absent. What remained showed a woman who was 34 years old, who had grown up in rural Montana, who had trained at Fort Benning and then at the Naval Special Warfare Sniper Course, one of only 3 women to complete the course in its history, and who carried a qualification score that Holt had to read twice because he wasn't sure the number was possible. He was skeptical. He was professionally, decorously, completely skeptical. He had not gotten to where he was by accepting things at face value, and a number on a qualification sheet was a number on a qualification sheet. Ranges were controlled. Field conditions were not. He had seen excellent range shooters fall apart the moment there were variables. Wind, altitude, emotion, the particular way time seems to dilate when the target is a human being and not a paper silhouette. He had seen good men miss. He had seen great men freeze. Range scores meant something, but they did not mean everything. He sent a request up the chain to have her reassigned. He was polite about it. He cited operational security, unit cohesion, the complexity of the specific mission profile they were preparing for, all of which were technically true, and none of which were the actual reason. The actual reason was simpler and less defensible, and he knew it even as he wrote it, which was why he chose not to write it. The request came back denied within 6 hours. Mara Voss arrived the following morning on a helicopter that also brought mail, replacement parts for a communications relay, and 400 pounds of MREs. She climbed down from the cargo area with her rifle case strapped across her back and a bag over one shoulder, and she stood on the landing pad for a moment, looking at the base, looking at the mountains beyond it, looking at the particular quality of light in the valley below, the way it pooled in the low places and left the ridge lines in cold shadow, and then she walked toward the operations building without being directed to it. As if she had already mapped the place in her mind during the descent. Holt met her at the door. He shook her hand. He was correct and formal, and exactly as courteous as his rank required. She was the same. They were two professionals doing the thing that professionals do when they do not yet trust each other. They performed the structure of trust while both understanding it was a performance. She had brown eyes and a stillness about her that was not passive. It was the stillness of something that had learned over a long time to hold a great deal of weight without showing strain. Her hands, when they shook his, were dry and cool and steady. That was the first thing he noticed. Hands always steady. Holt had a habit of watching hands. He showed her the operations room, briefed her on the mission profile, introduced her to the rest of the team. The team received her with the particular diplomatic blankness of people who had been told to be professional and were being professional, which is different from acceptance, and she understood the difference and showed no sign of being troubled by it. She asked 3 questions during the briefing: precise, technical questions about wind conditions at the ridgeline, about the specific topography of the valley floor, about the elevation differential between the proposed firing position and the target zone. They were the right questions. Holt noticed that too. She asked to go to the Grange that afternoon. Holt sent his best spotter, Petty Officer 2nd Class Jamie Ortega, with her. Ortega came back 2 hours later with an expression Holt had not seen on him before. Ortega was 26 years old and had been on 4 deployments and was not a man who was easily impressed by anything. "How'd she do?" Holt asked. Ortega picked up a water bottle, drank half of it, and said, "You should go watch." Holt went the next morning. She was already on the range when he arrived, lying in position behind her rifle. A Shitak M200 intervention chambered in .408, a weapon designed for exactly this kind of work. Long-range precision engagements at distances where most soldiers weren't even looking yet. She had set up at the furthest station a range marker indicating 1,800 meters to the target. Ortega was beside her with the spotting scope. Holt stood back and watched. She fired 5 rounds. Ortega called the impacts. All 5 were within a 3-inch group centered on the target. At 1,800 meters, in a crosswind that Holt estimated at 12 to 15 kilometers per hour, gusting, he said nothing. He watched her break down the position, clean up her brass, make a notation in her data book. She moved with a kind of economy that had no wasted motion in it. Every action connected to the next. She was not performing. She was working. She looked up and saw him. "Captain, Lieutenant Commander." A pause. "Wind was variable this morning," she said. "I'm still building the dope for this altitude. Different than anything I've worked at before. The air does strange things up here." "What kind of strange things?" "Unpredictable things." She said it without complaint, the way a mechanic might say a particular engine ran hot. It was a condition to be accounted for, not a problem to be solved. "I want another 2 days on the range before I'd be comfortable calling shots at distance in this environment." He gave her 3 days. He wasn't sure why he gave her the extra day. Maybe he was still testing. Maybe he was already beginning to understand something he wasn't ready to articulate yet. During those 3 days, Mara Voss did not socialize much. She was not unfriendly. She ate in the common area, responded when spoken to, was polite to everyone without exception. But she did not seek company the way some people do when they are new to a place and uncertain of their standing. She seemed entirely comfortable inside her own silence. At night, after dinner, she sat at the table in the corner of the common room with her data book open and a pen in her hand, filling pages with numbers and notations, wind readings, temperature logs, elevation calculations, observations about light behavior in the valley at different times of day. She was building a model. She was constructing, in the pages of a small green notebook, a precise and detailed picture of the environment she was going to have to shoot through. Ortega started sitting with her after the second night. Not talking, mostly. Just present. Sometimes he'd ask a question, she'd answer. He was learning from her and he knew it, and didn't try to pretend otherwise, which she seemed to appreciate. On the 3rd night, Holt walked through the common room and saw them both at the table, Ortega with his own data book now, copying something she'd drawn. A wind diagram. The way the valley channeled and deflected air based on its shape. He stood there for a moment, watching them, without intending to be watched, and he felt something shift inside him that he did not examine closely. He had been wrong about her range scores. They were not a controlled environment fiction. They were a floor, not a ceiling. The mission briefing was on the 4th day. The target was a logistics coordinator for a regional insurgent network, a man named in the intelligence reports only as Rakim, last name unknown, who had spent 4 years facilitating weapons transfers across 3 countries without once appearing in a place where conventional forces could reach him. He moved constantly. He trusted no one. He communicated through intermediaries and never slept in the same location twice. The intelligence window was narrow and specific. A morning meeting, a fixed location, a window of approximately 40 minutes during which reliable sources placed him at a farmhouse on the valley floor. The farmhouse was 3,247 meters from the only viable firing position on the ridge, 3,247 meters. That is not a typo and it is not an exaggeration. At that distance, a bullet from Mara's rifle would be in the air for approximately 4 seconds before impact. In those 4 seconds, it would drop hundreds of meters in arc, it would drift in the wind, it would be affected by temperature and pressure and the rotation of the Earth itself. A phenomenon called the Coriolis effect, real and measurable, and something that most people never have to think about, but that long-range precision shooters must account for in their calculations. At 3,247 meters, you are not just shooting through space. You are shooting through time and physics simultaneously. Holt looked at the distance marker on the terrain map and looked at Mara and said carefully, "This is outside confirmed engagement range for any documented precision shot in a combat environment. The current record is under 3,000. I know what the record is. A silence. Do you think you can make this shot?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the map. She looked at the elevation profile of the ridge. She looked at the table where her data book sat, all those pages of numbers and diagrams and careful patient observation. Then she looked at him. "I think I can make this shot if the wind holds within parameters, and I have 4 hours on the ridge before 0 hour to read conditions. I think I can make it if Ortega is on the scope, because I've been working with him and his calls are clean. I think I can make it if there are no variables I haven't already accounted for." A pause. There will always be variables I haven't accounted for. It was not bravado. It was not false modesty either. It was the most precise and honest answer she could give. He understood that. 4 hours on the ridge, he said. Ortega on the scope. You have both. They moved to the ridge on foot in darkness, a small team. Mara, Ortega, 2 security personnel, and Holt himself. He told himself he came for command oversight. That was true. It was not the complete truth. The complete truth was that he needed to see this, whatever it was going to be, with his own eyes. The ridge was cold and sharp, and the wind came off it in intermittent bursts that tasted of snow from the peaks further north. They arrived at the firing position at 0300 hours. The valley below was dark. The farmhouse was invisible at this distance, a coordinate rather than a structure, a point in space defined by GPS numbers and aerial imagery. Mara set up her position with the same economy of motion he had watched on the range. No wasted steps. The rifle went down first, oriented correctly, with the bipod extended. Then the spotting equipment for Ortega. Then her data book opened to a fresh page, a small red filtered headlamp clipped to her collar pointing at it. She began taking wind readings immediately. Ortega set up beside her, and they began working in the particular quiet shorthand that develops between good spotter-shooter pairs. Not much talking, mostly numbers, occasionally a single word that carried the weight of a sentence. Holt settled in behind them and watched the valley. The darkness was absolute in the low places. The stars above were the kind you only see at altitude, thick and brilliant and slightly closer feeling than they should be, the kind that make you understand why ancient people built religions around them. The wind moved through the grass on the ridge in long waves, and somewhere far below, the farmhouse sat waiting in the dark, not knowing it was being measured. At 0430, the first faint grey began at the eastern edge of the sky. At 0600, light reached the valley floor. At 0617, Ortega said quietly, movement at the structure. Mara's breathing, which had already been slow, became slower. She made a small adjustment to her scope. She made a notation in her data book. Her right hand rested on the grip without tension, the trigger finger lying alongside the guard, not on it. Not yet. The figure in the valley moved to the edge of the farmhouse and stood there, facing east. Apparently watching the same sunrise Holt was watching from the ridge. 3,247 meters and a world away. A small figure, barely distinguishable as human from this distance, visible only because Ortega's scope was very good and the morning light was cooperating. Confirmation? Mara said. Ortega was quiet for a moment, checking the imagery against what he was seeing. Confirmed, he said. She made one more small adjustment. Her breathing slowed to something barely perceptible. 4 counts in, a long pause, then out, then in again. And in that suspended space between breaths, between heartbeats, in the particular stillness that she had spent years learning to inhabit, she put her finger on the trigger. Holt was watching through his own scope. He was watching, and he was, in the privacy of his own skull where no one could see it, not sure. He was not sure she was going to make this shot. He had seen her on the range. He had watched her build her data. He understood what she was doing, and he was still not sure. The rifle fired. The sound, compressed and enormous, hit him in the chest. Through his scope, he watched. 4 seconds is a long time when you are waiting. Then the figure at the farmhouse was down. The sound of the shot, that long deep roar, came rolling back from the valley walls after the fact, bouncing off rock and stone, filling the air with an echo that took several seconds to fully decay. It was an extraordinary sound in the extraordinary silence of the morning. It sounded, he thought, like something final. Ortega said, "Impact confirmed." Mara did not move for a long moment. She stayed in position, her eyes still at the scope, her breathing resuming its normal pace as if she were walking home from somewhere. Then she made a notation in her data book. Then she was still again. Holt lowered his scope. He looked at the valley. He looked at the back of her head. He looked at Ortega, who was already doing the math, already recording the confirmed distance in his own log. He picked up the radio, and then, not thinking about it, not framing it, just saying the thing that was in his chest before his rank had edited it, he said, "Who's the target?" Ortega looked at him. Holt wasn't looking at the valley. He was looking at her. She had already moved to begin breaking down the position, methodical and unhurried. The data book closed and tucked into her vest. She was not celebrating. She was not looking at him. She was doing the next thing, the way she always did the next thing, with the complete and quiet focus of someone who has been doing the actual work while other people were still deciding whether to believe in her. He had asked the question without knowing he was asking it. But now, turning it over in his mind on that cold ridge with the dawn coming up over the mountains and the echo still dying in the valley below, he understood what he had meant. He had meant, who is this person? What did I just witness? What have I been wrong about, and for how long? And how much has that wrongness cost things I'll never be able to count? He didn't have the answers yet. He wasn't sure he deserved them yet. But for the first time since her orders had arrived on his desk, he stopped asking the wrong questions and started listening for the right ones. The helicopter came at 0900. The sun was fully up by then, the valley gold and wide and completely indifferent. Mara Voss carried her rifle case up the ramp without ceremony. She found a seat, buckled in, and opened her data book again. Already reviewing, already correcting, already building the model for the next time. Holt sat across from her in the cargo bay. The noise of the rotors made conversation impossible, which suited him. He had nothing ready to say yet. He was still inside the question. He watched her write in her book, and he thought about the 4 seconds a bullet spends in the air on its way to 3,247 meters. He thought about all the things that can change in 4 seconds. He thought about the fact that she had accounted for all of them, and that he had doubted her right up until the moment the doubt became structurally impossible to maintain. He thought about what that said about her. He thought more uncomfortably about what it said about him. The helicopter banked east, and the valley fell away below them, and somewhere in the mountains behind them, the echo of that shot was still bouncing, still working its way through stone and air and distance, long after the event that caused it had already ended. Back at FOB Kareem, the day went on the way days do, after extraordinary things, with paperwork, debriefs, logistics calls, the grinding, ordinary machinery of an operational base that does not stop because one woman made a shot no one had made before in a live combat environment. There were MREs to eat, and equipment to inventory and reports to file. The world does not pause for its own history. But the base felt different. It wasn't loud about it. Nobody made a speech. The team was professional, and professionals do not make speeches about things that have just been confirmed as classified operations in a forward operating theater, but in the small visible ways that culture shifts. In who got asked to pass something at dinner, in who people made eye contact with, in the particular quality of quiet that followed when Mara walked into a room. Something had changed. The angle of the thing had moved. Ortega ate next to her. He had been eating next to her for 4 days, but now there was no performance of professionalism in it. He was just a person sitting next to another person he respected. Two of the other team members, a pair of petty officers named Reyes and Church, who had been correctly but distantly polite since her arrival, stopped by her table after dinner. Church said something low that Holt didn't catch. Mara looked up from her data book, considered whatever he'd said, and replied with something that made both of them laugh. A real laugh, not a courtesy laugh, the kind that catches people off guard and escapes before they can manage it. Holt watched it happen from across the room and felt something he couldn't quite name. Not jealousy, something more like recognition. The team was deciding she was one of them, and they were doing it the way teams do, in the small, unremarkable moments that nobody writes into after-action reports. He sat in his office that night and read her file again. The whole thing, not just the qualification scores. He read it the way he should have read it the first time, which is to say slowly and with the intention of understanding rather than confirming what he'd already decided. She had grown up in a town called Havre in northern Montana. Population around 10,000. Mostly cattle country, wheat country. The kind of flat and enormous landscape that either breaks people or makes them capable of a particular interior spaciousness that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it. Her father had been a rancher. Her mother taught high school math. She had grown up hunting, whitetail, mule deer, elk, with a .243 her father had given her at age 11, and a standing rule that if you were going to kill something, you were going to kill it cleanly, and if you could not kill it cleanly from where you were, you would either move or you would not shoot at all. That was where it started, not in training, not at Fort Benning. In the cold mornings of a Montana field with a rifle and a set of ethics that understood precision as respect. She had gone to the University of Montana on an ROTC scholarship, majored in applied mathematics, graduated fourth in her class, commissioned as an ensign. Served 2 years in a logistics role because the Navy in those days did not have a clear mechanism for putting a woman with her specific combination of skills into the specific work she was suited for. 2 years of being managed into the wrong shape. Then she had heard about the Naval Special Warfare Sniper course. The course was not technically closed to women. It was also not in any practical sense designed with women in mind, or tested with women in mind, or historically survived by women who had tried and not completed it, not because they lacked ability, but because the environment was specifically calibrated to produce a narrow kind of failure, and the failure rate for everyone was extraordinary. The course's completion rate across all candidates regardless of gender hovered around 30%. It was designed to be that way, not cruel, just absolute. You met the standard or you didn't, and the standard did not negotiate. She applied. She was told, with various degrees of officiousness and genuine concern, that she should consider other pathways. She applied again, she was admitted, which was its own small battle, and she went to Coronado and did the thing. She completed it. 4 weeks of land navigation, shooting, stalking, data collection, wind reading, and the sustained application of absolute precision under sleep deprivation and physical stress, and the particular psychological pressure of being watched by people who expected to watch you fail. She completed it not at the middle of her class, but at the top of it, with a qualification score that had caused at least one instructor to go back and check the targets twice, because the groupings were anomalous. Then the waiting began, because completing the course was one thing. Being assigned to a unit that would actually use her in the role she qualified for was another. That took 2 more years. 2 more years of being technically qualified and practically sidelined, of being managed around the edges of the work rather than placed inside it, of institutional friction wearing at her with the patience of a river working on stone. She filed requests, she went through channels, she had advocates, and she had obstacles. And the obstacles often wore the same rank as the advocates. She did not quit. Holt thought about what that had cost her. He thought about the specific texture of that kind of endurance, not the dramatic endurance of a single crucible, a training course you can point to and survive with a date attached, but the grinding, invisible endurance of a system that keeps being in your way without ever quite being honest about why. He put the file down. He looked at the wall of his office, which was bare plywood, and he sat with what he was feeling, which was not comfortable. He had been part of that system. He had not built it. He had not intended harm, but he had, without examining it, accepted its assumptions, and he had acted on those assumptions when he filed that reassignment request, and he had been wrong, and the wrongness had not been accidental. It had been the predictable result of having never genuinely interrogated a thing he'd simply inherited. He was a man who prided himself on accuracy, on reading situations correctly, on not making assumptions where evidence was available. He had failed by his own standard, and the failure stung in a particular way because he understood exactly how it had happened. The next morning he found her on the range again. She was not shooting. She was lying in position, working her wind calls, running the scope across the valley below, making notations, training for a mission that hadn't been assigned yet, building the database that would make the next shot possible. He walked down and stood beside her for a moment. She didn't look up. She was working. "Montana," he said. She glanced up, a question in the look. "I read your file last night, the whole thing." She was quiet for a moment, reading what he meant. "Okay," she said. "I filed a reassignment request when your orders came through." She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, not anger. More like recognition. Like a thing she'd known and had been waiting to find out if he was going to say. "I know," she said. Of course she knew. People always know. "That was wrong," he said. "Not inaccurate in a technical sense. I had grounds, and I was within my authority. But wrong." She held the look for a moment longer, and then she did something he hadn't expected. She didn't accept it graciously. She didn't let him off the hook with a "thank you for saying that." She just nodded, once. The way you nod when someone says a true thing, and you're not going to argue with it, but you're also not going to perform gratitude for the acknowledgement of something that should have been obvious. "I filed 6 requests before I got placed in field deployable status," she said. "That was 4 years. 6 requests in 4 years from a top qualifying sniper school graduate." She paused. "I stopped expecting people to get it right in advance. I started just showing up and doing the work." He thought about that. He thought about the 6 requests. He thought about 4 years. "Is that how you want to operate?" he asked. Not challenging. Genuinely asking. "No," she said. "But it's what works." A pause. "So far." That conversation lasted maybe 6 minutes. She went back to her wind calls. He walked back up the ridge to the operations building, but something had been established between them that had not existed before. Not warmth exactly, not friendship, but a kind of honest ground. A place where both of them knew where the other stood. He started calling her into planning sessions in a different way. Not as the shooter being briefed on a mission, but as a contributor to mission architecture. Because she saw things through the glass that changed how targets needed to be approached, and that intelligence was wasted if it only arrived at the end of the planning process. She had a mathematical mind and a field-level understanding of environment that, combined, produced analysis he hadn't been able to get from anyone else on the team. He started listening earlier. She started, slowly, contributing earlier, asking questions in the room instead of only after the room had decided, challenging things when she saw a better geometry to a problem. He let her challenge things. Sometimes she was right, sometimes he pushed back, and they worked it out, and the result was better than either position had been separately. That was how it was supposed to work, and it had taken 6 days of her being on his base and 247-meter shot before it started working the way it was supposed to. The team adjusted. Reyes and Church were on board already. The other holdout, a petty officer named Dowd, who had been the quietest and most consistent in his distance, came around in a way that was very specific and not glamorous. He came around because she fixed his data book. Dowd had been struggling with long-range accuracy for months. His equipment was fine. His fundamentals were solid, but his cold bore data, the first shot accuracy before a barrel has warmed, was inconsistent, and inconsistent first shots in their line of work were not academic problems. She watched him shoot one afternoon and asked to look at his data book. He gave it to her. She spent 20 minutes with it, made 3 suggestions that took her about 4 sentences to explain, and watched him apply them over the next hour. His cold bore groupings tightened by about 40%. He didn't say much about it. He nodded when she handed back his book. But after that day, whenever she walked into the common room, he made space. That's how respect usually moves. Not in speeches, in the small adjustments people make when they've been shown something they couldn't see before. 3 weeks after the Valley shot, a signals intelligence report crossed Holt's desk that changed the shape of the next operation. The target was a different man. Higher value, more mobile, with better security and a pattern of movement that made conventional approach vectors extremely difficult. The analysis window suggested a single viable engagement opportunity, a specific 4-minute period during which the target would be exposed at a location that had been identified through signals correlation. The problem was the location. The only viable firing position required a 900-meter shot across a river valley, not as long as the first, but more difficult in a different way. The valley funneled wind in ways that Mara's data from the first operation had specifically noted as unpredictable. She had written, in her data book after the first shot, a single line. "This valley changes its mind." She meant the wind. The topography did something to the air behavior that made modeling unreliable. She had made the first shot inside a window of relative stability. That stability was not guaranteed. She said this in the planning meeting, clearly and without equivocation. The shot was feasible. It was not certain. The wind risk was real. If conditions did not hold, she would miss, and a miss meant the target was alerted, the intelligence window was burned, and 4 months of collection work was wasted. Holt looked at the intelligence product. He looked at the mission clock. He looked at her. What percentage confidence in a clean shot if conditions hold within your parameters? She thought about it. Really thought about it, not performing deliberation but actually running the numbers in her head. 91, she said. And if they don't hold? It depends on how much they move. Minor drift, I can compensate. A turn of more than 10 degrees in the wrong direction inside the final 2 seconds. She paused. I call off the shot. You call it off, he repeated. Yes. He held that for a moment. There would be pressure when the moment came. There always was. The intelligence investment, the operational timeline, the presence of a high-value target in the scope, all of it creating gravity toward the trigger. He was asking her to tell him she could resist that gravity. If you call off the shot, he said, I back you. No debrief questions about the decision. No second guessing. You call it and it's called. She looked at him. Something in her face said she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for someone to say exactly that. Not with surprise, more like relief that moved through her quickly and didn't stay. Understood, she said. The mission was scheduled for 6 days out. In those 6 days, Mara and Ortega went to the Valley Ridge every morning before dawn and spent 3 to 4 hours reading conditions. She built in those 6 days what she called a wind portrait of the valley, a time-mapped analysis of how air moved through the terrain at different hours of the day, how temperature change affected the behavior, how the ridgeline shape created channels and vortices that would influence a bullet's path. She filled 23 pages of her data book. Holt found himself going down to the ridge in the evenings sometimes, not for any operational reason, just to watch the valley from that height. It was a beautiful place, if you could separate it from its function. The mountains beyond it were enormous and old and not interested in any of the things happening at their feet. The light in the late afternoon had a particular quality, going golden and then deep orange, the shadows running long across the valley floor, the river below a thin, bright line. He thought about what she'd said about growing up hunting in Montana, about clean shots and the ethics of distance, about the idea that if you could not kill it cleanly from where you stood, you moved or you didn't shoot at all. He thought about how that ethic had followed her here, not as philosophy, but as practice. Every calculation in those 23 pages of data was the same thing that her father had meant in that Montana field. You don't take the shot unless you know what the shot is. And you know what the shot is only if you have done the work. He had spent his career building something similar from a different direction. From discipline, from training, from the accumulated experience of operations that had gone right and operations that had gone very wrong. He had built accuracy into himself the hard way. She had too. The materials were different, the structure was the same. On the 5th night before the mission, he walked into the common room and she was at her table with the data book. The room was quiet. Most of the team was asleep. The red-filtered lamp clipped to her collar threw a dim glow across the page. She was writing something, and whatever it was, she was writing it with the focused attention of someone for whom the page was the only thing in the room. He made coffee, poured a cup, and sat down at the far end of the table. Not close enough to read over her shoulder. Just present. After a while, she said without looking up, the wind in this valley follows the temperature gradient. When the air above the ridge cools faster than the air over the river, it falls. When it falls, it compresses in the valley and turns northeast. The timing of that turn is the variable I still don't have a clean model for. How close are you? Closer than yesterday. She turned a page. Not close enough. What would close enough look like? She considered that. One more morning, maybe 2. A pause. Or it happens in the field and I read it in real time and either I'm right or I'm not. Which of those would you choose? She looked up. The lamp made her face half shadow. The morning, she said. Always the morning. Preparation over improvisation. He nodded. They sat in the quiet for a while after that. 2 people at a table in a forward operating base at altitude with a mission 6 days away, and it was the most normal thing that had happened since she arrived. Just 2 professionals who had started, past all the friction and assumption and structural garbage that had been in the way at the beginning, to understand each other. It wasn't a grand moment. It wasn't the shot, with its physics and its 4-second wait and its roaring echo in the valley. It was just coffee and a red lamp and a data book, and 2 people figuring out how to work together in the particular way that the work required. But in its own way, it mattered just as much. Outside, the mountain wind moved across the ridge, and the valley below was dark. And somewhere in the darkness the river ran over its stones with total indifference to what was coming, and the data book kept getting fuller, and the morning was 6 hours away. The morning of the second mission was grey. Not dramatically grey, no storms building on the ridgeline, no visible weather event. Just the particular flat grey of high altitude before the sun clears the eastern peaks, a colour like unpolished steel that makes distances hard to judge and silhouettes harder to read. Mara had noted this in her data book as a potential variable. Grey sky diffusion scatters light differently than direct sun, and the way a spotter's scope resolves a target at 2,900 meters depends in part on ambient light contrast. She had a note for it. She had a note for everything. They moved to the ridge at 0245, 3 hours before the intelligence projected window. Holt had approved the early movement without question. She had asked for 4 hours, and 4 hours was what the data required, and after what he'd seen 3 weeks ago in this same valley, he was not going to be the thing standing between Mara Voss and her preparation time. The team moved in cold silence. The ridge path was steep enough that talking required energy nobody wanted to spend, and dark enough that everyone moved by feel and memory and the soft red glow of shielded lights. Ortega was directly behind her the whole way up, carrying the spotting equipment, his footfalls matched to hers by some developed instinct. They had become, in 3 weeks, the kind of partnership that requires very little maintenance, each one knowing what the other needed before it was asked. A professional intimacy built from hours of shared silence in firing positions, and the specific trust of people who rely on each other's accuracy for outcomes that matter. The firing position was a natural shelf in the rock face, about 2 meters wide and perhaps 1.5 meters deep, barely enough room for 2 people and their equipment without encroachment. The valley dropped away below it in a long swooping fall of 300 meters before leveling into the flat agricultural land where the river ran and the target's vehicle would pass. At this hour, nothing moved in the valley. A few distant lights from a village several kilometers east. Otherwise, darkness, the river, the grey sky above, and the cold. She set up by feel in the dark, working the equipment into position with hands that had done this enough times that the darkness made no difference to the quality. Rifle down, bipod set, scope aligned, spotting equipment to the left for Ortega. Data book open, headlamp on. She began taking readings immediately. Temperature, atmospheric pressure, the wind that moved across the ridge in slow, deliberate gusts from the north-northwest. The wind was not good, not terrible, but not good. She wrote numbers and circled one and put a question mark next to it. Ortega looked over and read the number. He didn't say anything. He understood what the question mark meant. It meant, this is the variable. Watch this. Holt was positioned 3 meters back from the shelf, close enough to receive Ortega's calls and monitor the communications link with the intelligence feed, far enough back that his presence was not a pressure on the position. He had learned, in 3 weeks, the specific courtesy of not being in a shooter's peripheral awareness when the work was happening. Some things you don't understand until you watch someone do them at a high level, and one of those things is that the environment immediately around a precision shooter is not neutral space. You are either contributing to the position or you are adding variable. Nothing in between. At 0400, the wind shifted. Not catastrophically. A change of about 15 degrees in bearing, coming now more from the north than the north-northwest, and with it a slight decrease in velocity from the previous reading. Mara wrote the new numbers. She compared them to the portrait she had built over the 6 previous mornings. The shift was within the range of what she had observed before. It matched roughly the temperature gradient behavior she had described at the table 4 nights ago, the air falling off the ridge, compressing in the valley, beginning to turn. Northeast, she said quietly, not to anyone in particular. To the data book. Matching the model? Ortega asked. Close enough to be encouraging, not close enough to stop watching. At 05000, the grey in the sky began to lighten. The mountains to the east, which had been masses of absolute dark, began to acquire edges. The valley resolved slowly out of darkness into shape. The river visible first as a thin thread of reflected skylight, then the flat land around it becoming identifiable as land, then the road, the irrigation channels, the scattered structures of the farming community along the valley floor. The farmhouse that was the target's projected route marker was 2,900 meters away. At this light level and this magnification, it was a grey rectangle with a darker rectangle that was the road in front of it. Nothing moved. Mara made an adjustment to her scope, a minor elevation correction based on the morning temperature versus her modeling baseline. She wrote the correction in her data book, then verified the input on the turret dial, checking it with her fingertip the way a musician checks a tuning before playing. Small motion. Complete certainty in the motion. 0537. The intelligence feed, relayed through Holt's earpiece from the collection team operating east of the valley, reported a vehicle on the access road, 12 kilometers out, moving at estimated 40 kilometers per hour. Mara's breathing did not change. Holt said quietly, 12 kilometers, estimated 12 minutes. Received, she said. Ortega put his eye to the spotting scope. The next 12 minutes were among the most concentrated Holt had ever experienced in an operational setting. Not loud, not dramatic in any visible way. 2 people lying on a rock shelf and a third man kneeling behind them, and everyone breathing and the wind doing what wind does, which is be inconsistent. The wind was the only thing in the valley with agency in that moment, the only variable that would not hold still to be calculated. Everything else had been accounted for. The distance, the elevation, the temperature, the ammunition, the rifle's specific ballistic characteristics, the limits of Mara's own physiology. All of it absorbed into the model in that data book. The wind was the last negotiation. At 0544, the vehicle appeared at the near end of the access road. Through Ortega's scope, it was clearly identifiable as the projected target vehicle. Make, color, approximate plate series, all consistent with the intelligence product. It slowed as it approached the farmhouse, then stopped. Target vehicle confirmed, Ortega said. Mara made one more scope adjustment. Held. The wind was moving at a bearing of approximately 12 degrees east of north, at a velocity Ortega called as 9 kilometers per hour, with gusts to 14. The gusts were the problem. At 2,900 meters, a gust of 5 extra kilometers per hour on a crosswind component could displace a bullet by significant margin. Not a miss at that deviation, but potentially a wound rather than an incapacitation, and a wounded high-value target who could still speak into a radio was not the outcome required. She was watching the grass in the valley floor. A shooter at this range does not only read wind at the firing position, they read wind at multiple points between themselves and the target. The grass, the dust, the river surface, flags if there are any, and they build a composite picture of the air column through which the bullet will pass. She had watched this valley for 6 mornings. She knew how the grass moved when the wind was useful and how it moved when it wasn't. The door of the vehicle opened. A figure stepped out. Movement, Ortega said. Single individual matches profile moving toward the structure. The figure walked to the farmhouse door, stopped, turned. Appeared to be looking at something to the east. Standing still. The wind dropped, not to zero, down to approximately 6 kilometers per hour, and in that drop the gusts smoothed, the grass in the valley lay more quietly, and the air column between the ridge and the valley floor settled into something closer to what her model required. Wind down, Ortega said. 6, bearing north-northeast. Holding dime. He was already on the trigger. The breathing. 4 counts in. The long hold. The world at the end of the scope very still. The figure at 2,900 meters standing in the grey morning light looking east. The crosshair doing the small involuntary dance that no shooter can eliminate entirely. The heartbeat somewhere in the background that she had trained herself to shoot between. The rifle fired. The sound was enormous and immediate and then gone, and the echo came back from the valley a moment later, and then silence. Impact confirmed. Ortega said. Holt let the breath out. He had not known he was holding it. Mara stayed in position for another 10 seconds. Verifying, watching, accounting for any secondary development. Then, she began breaking down with the same economy of motion, the same unhurried completeness. Data book closed, scope caps on, bipod folded, rifle cased. The wind, as if its job were done, picked up again. 9 kilometers per hour, then 12, then a gust that bent the grass on the ridge edge and carried a fine spray of cold vapor off the rock face. If it had been doing that 30 seconds ago, the shot would have been called off. The window had been a window. Narrow, real, and then closed. She wrote something in the data book after she cased the rifle. Holt could see her writing, but not what she wrote. Later, when she left the data book on the common room table for an hour, he looked. Not covertly. It was open, the page face up, and he stood there and read it. She had written, Wind portrait confirmed. Timing variable resolved, 6-second window of acceptable condition. Thermal descent pattern held to model. Shot cold inside window. And below that, in different ink, as if added afterward, 4 mornings was enough. Trust the preparation. He stood there for a moment, and then went and made coffee, and came back, and she was at the table again with the book, and he didn't say anything about what he'd read, but he kept it. Trust the preparation. He had spent 22 years building that into himself from the operations side. Contingency planning, rehearsals, equipment verification, the patient construction of a plan that could survive contact with reality. She had built the same thing from the precision side, from the mathematics of distance and atmosphere. Different languages for the same discipline. He thought about what she had said in the planning meeting. 91% confidence if conditions hold, and they had held for 6 seconds inside a 40-minute window. That was not luck. That was 6 mornings of pre-dawn observation and 23 pages of data and a mind that understood the valley well enough to recognize the moment when the valley was offering what it had been refusing all morning. Luck was what happened when you hadn't prepared. What she had done was something else. The debrief happened that afternoon. Standard process, timeline review, communication log verification, intelligence correlation, Holt ran it. She answered questions with her usual economy, giving exactly what was asked and not performing modesty or theater about it. Ortega corroborated every call. The record-keeping was clean, the outcome confirmed, the intelligence product validated. It was, by any measure, a successful operation. After the debrief, the unit's senior intelligence officer, a quiet, precise woman named Lieutenant Ewan who had been attached to the FOB for 2 months, pulled Holt aside in the corridor. Second confirmed engagement at extreme long range, Ewan said. Yes. Both shots clean. Yes. Ewan looked at him for a moment. I'm submitting both engagements for documentation to SOCOM. This will be on paper at a level above this FOB. I'd expect that, Holt said. When this hits the documentation chain, Ewan paused. It won't stay quiet. He understood what she meant. 2 confirmed long-range precision engagements in a classified operational theater, one of them a distance that exceeded the documented combat record. On paper, with confirmed intelligence corroboration. When that paperwork reached the right desks, people were going to want to know who the shooter was. Her record speaks for itself, he said. Yes, Ewan said. It does. That's exactly what I mean. She walked away. Holt stood in the corridor and thought about that. About what visibility meant. For a woman who had spent 4 years filing requests and showing up and doing the work and being sidelined anyway. About what it meant for those records to be going up the chain, not as an advocacy effort, not as a petition for fairness, but as verified operational intelligence that would be processed the same way any confirmed engagement report was processed. She had not asked for recognition. She had simply done the work to a standard so high that the documentation of it was an institutional requirement. That evening the team had something approaching a celebration, which is to say they sat in the common room after dinner, and Reyes produced a bottle of something that he declined to specify the origin of and poured it into cups, and nobody asked questions. Ortega said something that made everyone laugh. Church made a toast that was technically about the mission but was clearly also about something else, and everyone understood what else it was about, including Mara, who raised her cup without ceremony and drank and said nothing but looked around the table at each of them in a way that said what she was feeling without performing it. Holt lifted his cup. He looked at her across the table. She met his eyes. He had arrived at something that he didn't have a clean word for. Not admiration. That was too small. Not respect. He'd had something functioning as respect for 3 days after she first showed him the range. This was something that arrived after you'd watched someone live out their ethics at the edge of the possible, consistently, without audience, and gotten it right. It was the particular regard you have for the work when the work is done exactly as it should be. He didn't say any of that. He drank his cup and set it down, and Reyes was already making someone else laugh, and the evening went on. Later, when most of the team had gone to sleep, she was at her table again. The data book was open. He was surprised to see her writing in it still. The mission was over, the data collected, the portrait of the valley complete. He sat down at the end of the table with the remains of his coffee. What are you writing? Notes for whoever works this area next. She turned the book toward him slightly. He could see the dense notations, wind behavior, temperature patterns, topographic observations, timing windows, all of it organized with the precision of a technical document. This valley has a logic to it. It took me 6 mornings to understand it. If the next person has these notes, it might take them too. He looked at the book. You're building a manual. I'm building a dataset, she said. A manual implies I'm teaching something. I'm just recording what I found. He thought about the distinction. Does it matter? She considered that honestly. To me it does. A pause. I learned most of what I know from hunters who wrote things down. Guides, outfitters, older people who'd been in a place long enough to understand it. They didn't call it instruction. They called it notes. But someone else read the notes and it saved them years. Your father? She glanced at him, a small surprise in the look. Among others, he kept logs going back 15 years. Wind patterns by month, where elk moved in early November versus late. Water sources that dried up in drought years. She looked back at the book. You can spend years figuring out what someone else already figured out. Or you can read the notes. You're leaving these notes here, he said. even though you'll go wherever the next assignment is. Someone else will work this terrain. Maybe it's useful. Maybe it isn't. She shrugged, a small motion that was less about indifference and more about the absence of the need for credit. The valley will still be here. He looked at the book and thought about what it actually was. Not notes, not a manual, not a dataset. It was a gift. Practical, anonymous, probably never attributed to her specifically, certainly not written for recognition. She was leaving the sum of her preparation for a stranger who didn't know her name and might not think to wonder how the information got there. That was the thing, he thought. That had been the thing from the beginning, even when he hadn't seen it yet. She was not doing any of this to be seen. She had filed 6 requests over 4 years and made 2 shots that broke records and built a portrait of a valley that could save the next shooter 2 weeks of preparation, and none of it was performance. None of it was directed at anyone. It was all directed at the problem, at the work itself, at the specific serious business of doing the thing correctly. He had spent 22 years in a world that rewarded performance alongside achievement, where the after-action story and the actual action were often entangled, where visibility was a kind of currency. He understood it. He had operated inside it skillfully, but he had also, somewhere in the accumulated weight of 22 years, started to assume that the way things were recognized was connected to how real they were. She had never made that assumption. She couldn't afford to. The people who recognized her work were the people who watched her do it, and even some of those had taken a 247-meter shot to get there. The lamp threw red light across the page. The mountain wind moved outside. The data book got 1 more page of notes, carefully written, for no one in particular and anyone who needed it. He finished his coffee. He stood up. "Good night, Lieutenant Commander." She looked up. "Good night, Captain." He walked out into the mountain dark, and the stars were extraordinary overhead. And somewhere below the ridge, the river moved over its stones the way it had moved over its stones for 10,000 years, and nothing in the valley had changed, and everything in him had. "Who's the target?" SEAL Captain shocked as her 3247M shot roared across the valley.